You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome. My name is Frank Ambrosio. I'm the co-director of the My Dante project at Georgetown University. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to a reading of Inferno, the first canticle of Dante's Divine Comedy. It's voiced by Danny Fitzpatrick, and he's reading his own translation of the poem, which he recently completed in commemoration of the 700th anniversary of Dante's death in 1321. Poetry is meant to be spoken and heard. As Danny speaks, listen for the simplicity and economy of the English words and rhythms which Danny has discovered at work in Dante's native Italian. In their music and textures, we hear the primal power with which they break forth from silence, revealing the whole world, together with all of us, the living and the dead. So let's join Danny Fitzpatrick now on Dante's journey.
Hello and welcome back to the Dante in a Year podcast. My name is Danny Fitzpatrick. I'm so thankful to everyone in the Jackson, Mississippi area who came out to the Blaylock Photography Studio and also to St. Richard's Church this past weekend. Had a great time with everybody there. And some of my discussions with people there made me want to bring up a few points that we might consider before we dive back into the text today. So we're jumping into Canto 22. At the end of Canto 21 and throughout Canto 21, in fact, we see a lot of some of those things that might be considered traditionally comic in the Divine Comedy. So, of course, the comedy in a general sense is called a comedy because it's a story that ends on a happy note. It's a story that ends in the confidence of God's salvific power. But there are moments that are just really funny throughout the narrative. So here, in Canto 21, for instance, we get a lot of the imagery that we might typically associate with kind of silly devils in the underworld. So we have these kind of goofy characters who are always fighting each other, who have silly sounding names, and the canto ends with one of them making a trumpet of his butthole and using that as kind of his signal to command his devilish troops. So, that said, there is that kind of comedy there. There's also something very dark involved, because these devils are about to trick Dante and Virgil. And Dante and Virgil are going to be in a lot of danger as a result of that. And this isn't the first time in the Inferno that we've seen a real sort of danger for the heroes. So, of course, there's the appearance of Medusa, which we get the sense has a real weight to make it so that Dante's trip to hell never ends, right? So there's a sense in which any kind of journey into any kind of observation of hell is something that needs to be undertaken with the utmost caution and with the understanding that if things go wrong, there might not be any coming back from this. So, just something kind of interesting to keep in mind as we go forward, and we're going to move along into Dante's Inferno, Canto 22. Now I've seen the cavaliers move from camp, and make muster and commence their storming, and other times depart for their escape. I have seen the coursers in your land, O Aretines, and I've seen the whirling horsemen brave tournaments and run jousts. Sometimes with trumpets, and sometimes with bells, with drums and with signs from the castle, and with our own ways and those of foreigners. Not once with such a strange little signal have I seen cavalry or foot soldiers move off, nor ships at a sign from land or from a star. We went with the 10 demons. Ah, what fierce company! But in the church with the saints, and in the tavern with the gluttons. My notice was purely in the pitch, to see all the contents of the pouch, and of the people who were boiled within. As the dolphins, when they signal to mariners with the arch of their backs, to make ready to preserve their bark, so now, to allay the pain, a sinner would show his back, and descend again in less than a flash. and as at the edge of the water in a ditch, the little frogs stay with just their muzzles out, so that their feet and their thickness are concealed. So stayed the sinners on every hand. But as Barbariccia approached, so they retreated below the boiling. I saw there, and still my heart cowers for it, one who waited, as it occurs that one frog remains and another disappears. And Graffiacane, who was closest to him, hooked him by the pitch-thick mane and dragged him up, so that he seemed to me an otter. I now knew all of their names, as I'd noted them when they were elected, and attended to what they called each other. "Oh, Rubicante, put your claws to his body so that you score him," shrieked all those ill-spoken ones together. And I, "My master, if you can, see who is the wretch come to the hand of his adversaries." My leader drew close to his breast. He asked where he was from, and he responded, "I was born of the region of Navarre. My mother placed me in the service of a lord, as I was begotten by a rogue, destroyer of himself and of his things. Then I was family to the good King Teboldo. There I put myself to barratry, for which I render reason in this heat. And Ciriato, from whose mouth rose on both sides a tusk like a pig's, made him feel how one could tear. The mouse was come among bad cats, but Barbariccia closed him up with his arms and said, 'Stand there while I fork him.' And he turned his face to my master. 'Ask on,' he said, 'if you desire to know more of him, before the others disfigure him.' So my leader, 'Say now, of the other wretches below the pitch, do you know any Italians?' And that one, 'I parted from one a moment ago who was of that region. Oh, if I were still covered with him, I'd not fear claw or hook.' And Libicoco said, 'We've suffered too much,' and took his arm with the scourge, so that, straining, he tore open a wound. The Ragazzo also wished to grip him by the legs, at which their leader rounded upon them with an evil countenance. When their rapture had passed a bit, my leader undelayed asked of him, still marvelling at his wound, 'Who is that from whom you ill departed, so that you might come to shore?' And he responded, 'It was Fra Gomita, that man of Gallura, vessel of every fraud, who had in hand the enemies of his land, and did such to them that each lauds him. He took money and let them go smoothly, as he says, and in his other offices he was no little barrator, but the sovereign. Don Michel Zanche of Logodoro had use of him, and to speak of Sardinia their tongues feel no weariness. Oh my, see that other that grinds his teeth. I'd speak still, but I fear that one is preparing to grate my ringworms.' And the great provost now turned to Farfarello, who widened his eyes to attack, and said, 'Get away, you wicked bird.' 'If you wish to see or hear,' began again the pressed spirit, Tuscans or Lombards, 'I can have them come. But let the Malebranche stand back a bit, so that they'll not fear their vengeance. And I, sequestered in this same place, for the one that I am, will cause 7 to come when I whistle, as we are used to doing the moment one breaks out.' Cagnazzo lifted his muzzle at this comment, rolling his head, and said, 'Hear the malice he's thought up to hurl himself down.' At which he, who'd laced up great devices, responded, 'I am too malicious when I procure more distress for my fellows.' Alicino couldn't contain himself, and counter to the others, said to him, 'If you leap, I'll not come after you on the run, but I'll beat my wings over the pitch. Let's leave the crest and let the bank shield us, to see if you alone prevail against us.' Oh, reader, you'll hear a new game. Each turned his eyes the other way, him first who'd been most harsh. The Navarrese chose his time well. He set his feet to the ground, and in a moment leaped and escaped from their schemes. At that each was pierced with guilt, but that one most who was cause of the defeat. So he rushed on and shrieked, 'Now you're caught!' But it availed him little, for wings won't catch a suspect. That one went below, and the devil, flying, right at his chest. Not otherwise does the duck suddenly, when the falcon comes near, plunge below, and the raptor returns broken and enraged. Calcabrina, enraged by the bluff, kept close behind in flight, hoping his escape would cause a scuffle. And as the barrator had disappeared, he turned his claws on his companion and grappled with him over the ditch. But the other sparrowhawk was well plumed, and worked his claws well, and both fell in the midst of the boiling swamp. The heat undid them instantly, but there was nothing they could do to rise, as their wings had been so thickened. Barbariccia, sorrowing with the others, made 4 fly to the other coast with all their grapples, and presently here and there they descended to their posts. They bore their hooks to the dipped ones, who were now cooked into a crust, and we left them thus embroiled. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Dante in a Year podcast. See you next time for Dante's Inferno, Canto 23.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.